Okay, good evening. I'm Betsy Pratt from the Portland League of Women Voters. With me as backup this evening is my husband, Phil Thor. We both retired from the Bonneville Power Administration after 30-some years of working there, so we feel intimately connected with all the rivers that provide hydroelectricity for the region. Our goal for the meeting tonight is to have everybody share in that understanding and appreciation for the river. We're going to be running about a 90-minute taping ending about 8:30, but we will have some time after that if the audience questions are still vigorous. But in any case, we'll start about 9 o'clock. The League of Women Voters of Portland is a nonpartisan political organization that promotes informed and active participation in government. As Margaret said, membership is open to all, men and women who are interested in learning how the government operates and have a desire to make a difference. Tonight we will be hearing about the many factors that influence the Columbia River, including the legal aspects, the economic uses, the cultural and social impacts, and the factors affecting the health of the river. We hope the panel presentation will provide you with a better understanding of the complexity of these interacting components that need to be considered in local, regional, national, and even international decision-making. We have 3 guest speakers with us this evening who will each speak for about 20 minutes on different dimensions of the Columbia River resource. Just after 8 p.m., we will move to a question and answer segment, first allowing our panelists to ask questions of each other. And then, as Margaret said, we'll take questions from the audience, written clearly, please. Our first speaker is Michael Blumm, Jeffery Bain Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law from Lewis and Clark Law School. Professor Blumm is one of the architects of the law school's acclaimed Environmental and Natural Resources Law program. He has been teaching, writing, and practicing in the environmental and natural resources law field for 35 years. He came to the law school in 1978 after practicing with an environmental group in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C., where he helped draft the EPA's first wetland protection regulations. Professor Blumm's chief interests are in the restoration of the Pacific Northwest salmon runs, the preservation of the West public lands and waters, the management of natural resources by Indian tribes, the modern use of the public trust doctrine, and governmental authority to regulate private property for public purposes. He is a prolific scholar with well over 100 published articles, book chapters, and monographs on salmon, water, public lands, wetlands, environmental impact assessment, public trust law, and constitutional taking law, just to name a few topics. Professor Blumm will present a summary of the complex mix of law and treaties that impact the Columbia, with particular emphasis on updating the 1964 treaty and other current issues impacting the economic uses of the river and the health of the river, including fisheries and pollution, in 20 minutes. So listen fast. Okay.
I'm sorry you had to read all that.
I got to choose.
Thank you for attending. So what I want to do today is to, as there's not much time, to discuss 7 issues. Indian Treaty fishing rights, culminating in what we call the Culverts case, a case that hasn't yet been decided, or at least hasn't been decided by the appellate court. Endangered Species Act implementation culminating in another pending case, which we call the BIOP case, or at least I call it the BIOP case. The conflict between salmon and sea lions and salmon and cormorants, which involves several different federal statutes. Dam removal, which you could see the fruits of if you went 3 miles off the Columbia on your way up the gorge tomorrow on the White Salmon River. The Condit Dam, many of you may know, was removed 4 years ago now. And then I want to talk about the Gorge Act itself, a very unique piece of federal legislation authorizing revolutionary land use regulation. I'm going to talk about modernizing the Columbia Treaty and climate change and what it says, or what it should say about reforming water law. Okay, so we start here and I think you're going to get a better view of some of these things. There we go. Is that right? Yeah. From the other panelists, but I'm kind of a primitive guy. I'm not good at slides, and I don't put pictures behind text. I don't know how to do that. So anyway, the Columbia River, of course, originates in British Columbia and empties into the Pacific at Astoria. It has a large tributary, the Snake River, a source of quite a bit of controversy, that originates in Wyoming, outside of Jackson Hole. It's the 6th largest in North America. I saw another slide says the 4th largest in the United States, draining a lot of miles, almost 260,000 square miles. One of its chief characteristics, though, is that it's got highly erratic stream flow. Some years are big water years and some aren't. It's always been that way. We've had very good water years recently, but not this year, as you no doubt know. And the snowpack is frightening. But in most years, we have a large spring freshet that historically flushed salmon to the sea. And we've altered that freshet through the construction and operation of Columbia Basin dams. I guess that picture, that was a nice picture. Can I get back? Yeah. So if you look at that picture, you see all the dams. I don't have a pointer, but the red dams are Corps of Engineer dams. And the other dams are other dams. Most of the other dams are federally licensed dams. There's a few that are Bureau of Reclamation dams, like the Cooley Dam. But there's a big difference between federal dams and federally licensed dams, because the latter have licenses that expire. And that's one reason why the Condit Dam is no longer there. The federal dams don't have licenses and they don't expire. They were authorized by Congress. A big difference that you might not quite see from, well, you can see it if you look for the different colors there. So, and of course, the defining natural resource of the, that's not the right one. The defining natural resource is the salmon runs. Is that mine? I don't even know. I'm getting so confused now. Was that my slide? My goodness, that's a good slide. I hadn't realized. I thought that was somebody else's slide. Okay, well, there you go. So the transformation of the Columbia River took place in the last century, in the 20th century, out of the New Deal, really, to put people back to work, to electrify rural areas that investor-owned utilities like Pacificor and PGE wouldn't serve because it was uneconomical. So we got a public entity called the Rural Electrification Entity, I've forgotten now what it is, to bring electricity to the eastern parts of the basin. And so we have a mix of private and public projects. The public projects are all authorized for multiple purposes, although hydropower is not high on the list. In fact, it isn't. It's an incidental benefit for historical reasons. But nevertheless, today we have the largest interconnected hydroelectric system in the world and lots of endangered species because we've transformed what was a free-flowing river into a series of lakes. I want to start by talking about Indian treaties because it's a big part of the Columbia Basin, and because you're going to be driving past Celila Falls near the Dalles Dam, and perhaps you'll stop and take a look at what's the commemorative. There's a confluence project memory of Celila Falls at the site. Salmon, of course, were the basis of what was really the richest North American Aboriginal community, the salmon people of the Columbia Basin. They signed a series of treaties in the 1850s that enabled peaceful settlement of the Northwest, they ceded 64 million acres of land, retaining relatively small reservations. But the tribes who negotiated the treaties, which were all done in English that they didn't really understand in prearranged language, but the negotiator for the United States, Governor Stevens, he knew what they wanted. They wanted off-reservation fishing rights because their reservations were small and they didn't want to stop going to the places they'd always gone to. And so all the treaties that are called the Stevens Treaties in Article 3 say the tribes reserve, they weren't granted, they reserved the right to continue to fish at all their usual and accustomed spots in common with the citizens of the territory. They also had exclusive fishing rights on reservation. That was designed to be, and was in fact, to become an integral part of the pioneer economy. The tribes would fish and feed the settlers, and that happened for a fair amount of time before the equilibrium was upset by technology, according to my slide. Tin cans, refrigerated railroad cars, and other things like it, fish wheels, made salmon an export crop. And the profit motive kind of took over, and we had what some people call the tragedy of the commons, over-harvest because of this profit motive to reach distant markets through railroads as well as tin cans. The treaties also promised the tribes federal protection. If you read the negotiations, they didn't get much federal protection, except they got protection from federal courts. This is Celilo Falls. You won't see that tomorrow, but that's what it looked like until 1957, the great Indian Commons fishery that people from all over the region would come to fish at. So I'm in a real abbreviated law course here. There's a lot of judicial interpretation of these treaties. The Celilo Falls case, the original one's called U.S. v. Winans from 1905. It said that settlers couldn't fence off tribes from Celilo Falls, even though they owned the land from the United States government, from a grant from the United States government. They couldn't fence out the tribes. The tribes had what the court called a servitude, a right in land that burdened the private land title. That servitude was extended to the other side of the river in Suffolk Brothers some years later, even though the treaty itself didn't say anything about the Oregon side. It only said to the middle of the river, but the court said, we interpret treaties as the Indians would understand. And therefore extended it. In Tooley v. Washington in the 40s, the Winans principle, the Celilo Falls principle, was extended to fishing licenses, and the court determined that the state of Washington could not charge license fees to natives for exercising their treaty-guaranteed fishing rights. Then we had a complicated series of cases that involved all kinds of, those of you may remember, there was a lot of problems, a lot of demonstrations, even a shot or two fired around the Puyallup trilogy of cases, which said that the state could regulate the exercise of the treaty fishing right, but only for conservation, and the state had a very difficult time, especially the state of Washington had a very difficult time being fair about it. The court did say non-discriminatory, but the state just couldn't seem to do it. But the court, in one of the Puyallup cases, said, what we need here is an allocation. And that allocation was supplied by lower court judges, Judge Baloney here at the District Court of Oregon and Judge Bolt at the Western District up in Puget Sound to mean 50% of the harvest. And that was decided in 1974. The Supreme Court affirmed that in 1979. And then the Ninth Circuit in 1985 said that 50% harvest share also includes hatchery fish. Hatchery fish are about 80% of the fish in the Columbia River, so excluding hatchery fish would have been devastating to the tribes. So that was decided in 1985. Well, what wasn't decided in 1985 is what I have labeled here as U.S. v. Washington 3. Originally in 1970, the tribes argued for a harvest share, for hatcheries to be included in the harvest share, and for an implied right to protect the habitat that's necessary for the tribes to fish. And through a long, drawn-out set of legal proceedings, we're here in 2015 without an answer to that question. The justice sometimes works slowly. In what's called the Culverts case, now pending before the Ninth Circuit, it hasn't even been argued yet, and I'm not sure when it will be. The issue is whether the state of Washington is obligated by the treaty to maintain road culverts that are passable by fish. And if the state of Washington has to do that, other states and probably the federal government have to do the same thing. So it could be, it's clearly the largest fishing rights case on the docket in the Northwest today. It's called the Culverts case. It's before the Ninth Circuit. There's some other sovereignty questions that I've listed here. Those questions are the sovereignty that the treaties recognized was a pre-existing inherent sovereignty on the part of the tribes, but the Environmental Protection Agency has delegated sovereignty to tribes to act as states in statutes like the Clean Water Act, and tribes could have significant amount of power if they seize those opportunities from the EPA programs. 10 minutes, okay. Well, I'm going to have to go quicker. Okay, so the damming of the Columbia I mentioned took place in the 30s for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The rural electrification being among them. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons to have federal projects was to have them serve as what was called a yardstick against investor-owned utilities like PGE and PacifiCorp. So we could have a measurement about the rates that they were being charged to protect the public. Bonneville Power Administration became the power marketer of the federal dams that the New Deal authorized on the Columbia, and it's the power broker of the region to this day. But Bonneville does not have the authority to build projects. The Corps of Engineers successfully prevented that because they had seen what happened in the Tennessee Valley and they didn't want that. And so we have two agencies. We actually have 4 federal agencies that manage water, but 2 primary ones in the lower Columbia. The Corps, the project operator, and Bonneville, the power marketer. Among the projects that we have that the map had are projects on the Snake River, 4 Corps of Engineer dams on the Snake, above 4 larger projects on the lower Columbia. Those 4 lower Snake projects were authorized in, I think it was 1948 or so. They weren't completed until the mid-1970s, and the cost-benefit ratio on those projects was about 15 cents on the dollar. They were obviously authorized for purposes other than economics. Some people think the economics of them justifies taking them out. One of the characteristics of the Columbia Basin is it's operated by the Corps and Bonneville as a system, and it's been that way at least since the Columbia River Treaty was signed in 1964, reinforced by Congress in 1980 in the Northwest Power Act, and it's still true to this day. These projects are all operated as we would operate an integrated system, even though some of them are not federal projects. So now I have some pictures. And there's a fish ladder at a dam, and this, well, I had another one. Well, maybe that's all I got. One of them's been lost. So the big issue on the operation of the system today is it doesn't comply with the Endangered Species Act. 3 times the local federal district judge said no, is affirmed once or twice by the appellate court in the Ninth Circuit. It's back before a new federal district judge today, Judge Redden having retired. Judge Simon has the case before him. That one has been argued and is pending before him. He's no doubt going to decide whether there's ESA compliance, Endangered Species Act compliance, before the season starts in the spring. So I would expect a decision from him sometime in the late fall or shortly thereafter. The earlier decisions which enjoined the biological opinions under the Endangered Species Act mostly produced court-ordered spill at some of those Snake River projects to facilitate bypass by juvenile salmon. One issue before Judge Simon is whether to continue that spill. And that's an issue he'll have to decide. Another issue is climate change effects. As is dramatically apparent this year, the climate change is having an enormous effect on the health of salmon runs. We've lost hundreds of thousands of sockeye because of warm water. One of the things that Judge Redden, never ordered was flows put in the river. He only ordered spills at the dams to get the fish around the river. Flows might have lowered temperatures. Temperatures are killing fish, not just in the Columbia Basin, but killing salmon up and down the West Coast this year. There's like 8 big salmon die-offs because of temperature. That's because there's not enough water in the river, and that might become a permanent feature of our region. The federal government said in its biological opinion that it was too speculative to anticipate a climate change future. That's been challenged, and it'll be interesting to see what Judge Simon says about that. Then the other issue that I want to mention here is there's a massive commitment on the part of Bonneville and the federal government to restore habitat, mostly in the lower river, but not exclusively. And one question before the judge now is, can this effort at habitat protection, restoration, does that obviate the need to operate the projects differently? Because the projects don't operate very much differently than they always have, except for this court-ordered spill, which the federal government is arguing should be discontinued. Now, oh, whoops, I'm doing this wrong. There's the other fish ladder that I'm... So the big there are mortalities going up fish ladders, but the big problem has always been juvenile salmon going down these run-of-the-river projects. Okay, so I mentioned dam removal. This dam got removed because it was federally licensed, not federally authorized. And its license ran out, and the Federal Power Act and the Clean Water Act demanded fish passage at this dam, which was only 3 miles from the Columbia on the White Salmon River. And Pacific Corps said, we can't do it. It's too expensive. So they reached a settlement with a bunch of tribes and environmental groups that said, well, we'll take the dam out if you give us enough time to make some money to pay for it to go out, to pay the cost of having it go out, to take it out. And they got a 7-year deal, which turned out to be 12. But the dam, it turns out, that's what it looked like. Condit Dam. It was a pretty good-sized dam, but it wasn't a big part of Pacific Corps' load. That's what happened to it. It got blown up in 2011. You can go to Google and find this thing blowing up. It's very interesting. And this is what it looks like, well, I don't know, last year. It's a different world, and the vegetation will eventually come back. And all the studies, not necessarily on the white salmon, but all the studies in places where dams have been removed have shown remarkable regeneration of ecological function. So we can expect the same with the white salmon. Okay, so another issue, a couple more minutes. Salmon versus sea lions. Hot button issue. We're killing both. And we're litigating both, although the sea lion thing seems to be pretty much over. The courts have upheld the taking of some 85, lethal taking of some 85 sea lions. You may see a few at the Bonneville Dam. Wish them luck, whatever you think about them. I don't know. They don't all get offed, but some of them do. If they're repeat offenders, they go. And in the lower river, we got big plans to kill about 55 or 60% of the cormorant bird population that is congregated at the estuary, and they aren't killing adult salmon like the sea lions. They're killing juvenile salmon, which they're not as valuable. And there is a federal study here mentioned in the last part of the slide that says that these fish would probably get eaten by other predators anyway. Now, they tried to suppress that, but somehow it's gotten out, that study. And I think that might have an effect on the case. The judge denied a preliminary injunction, but the case is still before him. So we've got interspecies conflicts, including, our own species, which wants to take salmon. And there's a bunch of studies that say that the human species takes more than the sea lions anyway. The cormorants are taking juvenile salmon, so it's more difficult to say so. So that's my fourth issue. And I know I got a picture of them. Yeah, there they are. The cormorant is the one on the right. And that's the cormorant. 56% is the plan to get rid of them. And the disclosure, there's the study, is the last one, a NIMF study, National Marine Fisheries Service study, that says we don't think there would be any effect of leaving the cormorants alone, because if they get the juvenile salmon, if they don't get the juvenile salmon, somebody else will get them. It's a tough world out there for juvenile salmon. The returns, your chances of making it back to Bonneville Dam aren't great. All right, I'm running short of time. The gorge that you're going to drive through tomorrow is a remarkable place legally because of a compact that Congress authorized in a statute that we all owe a debt of gratitude to Senator Mark Hatfield for. And that compact put an interstate agency in an oversight role over local zoning boards, and with some authority indirectly anyway over the Forest Service. The gorge is an interesting place because 70% of it is not federally owned. Yet we have this scenic area with 70% private lands, and I think about 50,000 people live in the gorge. And yet it is being managed for aesthetics. I teach a lot of federal law. You don't find many federal statutes that are about aesthetics. This one is about aesthetics. So there's urban land, there's Forest Service land, and then there's the gorge compact managed land there. So you won't be able to see the difference, but you can see some of the results, and that's what the gorge looks like. You're going to go through it tomorrow. If I'd had my wits about me, I'd have done this so the slides would coincide with what you'll see first. But I'm a lawyer. I don't think that way. Modernizing the Columbia River Treaty. This is a remarkable thing, I think, because unlike the disarray that we see in the salmon world, the modernizing the Columbia River Treaty, the United States is unified. The tribes, the states, the Corps, the Bonneville Power Administration, and the State Department all want to see ecological function made to be a third purpose of the treaty. Right now, the purposes of the treaty are hydropower, and flood control. And that might change. We're negotiating a treaty. The treaty lasted for 30 years. It's expired, but they're continuing on an annual basis. But that's something to look for in the future. And there's the signers of the treaty there, Lester Pearson, and you may recognize President Eisenhower. And finally, how much time do I have left? Am I over?
I give you 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Do climate change in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Climate change and water farm. Western water law is based on certainty, not changing things. The assumption behind it was that the world wasn't going to change. That's not right. We changed, so we may need to rethink Western water law when we have situations in which glaciers are melting and water supplies are diminished. And I have some ideas here about what might be interesting to think about, but I can tell you that every sentient being in the agricultural community will oppose them, and they're very powerful. And so I think that public-spirited groups who are interested in modernizing water law reform should get involved, because it's going to be a long haul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Blumm. Our second speaker tonight is Kristin Meira, Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association. As PNWA's Executive Director, Kristin leads the association's work with Congress, federal agencies, and regional decision-makers on transportation, trade, energy, and environmental policies and projects. The membership includes over 130 public ports, transportation providers, agricultural and forest products producers, public utilities, manufacturers, municipalities, and others in the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Kristin serves on a number of boards and committees addressing transport and water issues, with a long list of acronyms, and maybe you can ask about if you want to know more. That's surprising how many different associations deal with these issues. Kristin moved to Portland in 2000 after spending 5 years on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where she worked for U.S. Senator Patty Murray and U.S. Senator Bill Bradley. Before joining the PNWA team in 2002, she worked for several high-tech and internet firms in the Northwest. She has a BA with a dual major in political science and history and a double major in English from Rutgers University. She makes her home in Damascus, Oregon, with her husband Eric, daughter Alex, and horses DJ and Lily. Kristin will speak on the role of the river in the economy of the region, the importance of river infrastructure in providing for business and trade in the region, and issues that impact economic uses. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I appreciate it. Thank you, Phil. Thank you to the League for having me here today, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm meeting Michael for the first time, but Paul and I are on this circuit often together, speaking together, so thank you for having me. I'm going to give you a brief overview today of navigation and cargo movement on the river system, and then I think I'm going to finish up with a couple of slides on the Columbia River Treaty and the BIOP and how we're doing with our fish these days. So just to orient you to where you are in the world, a map for you showing the extent of the Columbia Snake River system, the way that we think of it back in our office, and that's for cargo transport. Oh. There we go. So drilling down, we essentially have a two-part river system. We have the deep draft lower Columbia River from Astoria that goes 105 miles all the way here to Portland and to Vancouver. I'll be talking a little bit more about the kinds of activities that happen on the lower river. But you see there that figure of 40,000 jobs dependent on just that deep draft channel. That's an old figure, and we believe that's actually a low figure. This is a major economic and jobs driver here in the region. So then moving on, oops. Oh boy. So moving on then, once you leave the Portland-Vancouver area, you would be on our 14-foot deep barging channel that goes 365 miles inland on the Columbia, meeting up with the Snake River near the Tri-Cities, all the way to Clarkston and Lewiston. And you would go through 8 navigation locks along the way. And so when we think about why cargo transport is important on this river system, the first thing we think about is grain. We are tops in the nation here on the Columbia Snake River system for wheat exports. Roughly half of all of the wheat exported out of the United States is exported through the Columbia River. We're also now number 2 in the nation and growing for soybeans. And thinking about wheat, wheat in particular moves by barge on our river system. The Palouse region of the inland Northwest has the highest wheat production per acre of anywhere in the United States. We have a tremendous amount of soft white wheat being produced in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, northern Idaho, western Montana. It is traveling down the Snake and Columbia Rivers by barge. Some of it is also going by rail, and it's coming down here to 7 enormous export facilities in Portland, Vancouver, Kalama, and Longview, and then going out to feed the world. And we crunched some numbers in the last couple of years, and we're able to confirm that 10% of all U.S. wheat exports, 10%, are moving through the Snake River alone by barge. We're also tops on the West Coast for mineral bulks. A lot of that is potash that comes down from Saskatchewan and is exported through the Port of Portland there at Canpotex. Tops on the West Coast for wood exports, a lot of that departing out of Port of Longview. Yep. Number 2 now on the West Coast for auto imports and now some exports. I think I'm in the dead zone here with this clicker. There we go. No. And then going back to what's moving on our inland system, we do have more than just wheat. We also have petroleum products moving in double-hulled barges with Tidewater barge lines going up to a tank farm in the Tri-Cities to feed the petroleum needs of eastern Washington, and then other products as well. Just want to give you a quick tour of a sample navigation lock on the river system. I'm not sure if you're going to tour any or if any of you have been out to Bonneville Dam, but there are 8 locks, as I mentioned before, 4 on the Columbia, 4 on the Snake. This is an aerial view of the Dalles Dam with the navigation lock in that circle. And so in that circle, that's the lock there. Showing you which way is downstream, which way is upstream. Each one of our locks, at each of these projects, it's just one chamber. And then this will give you a sense of the scale of these navigation locks. This is a view of the downstream gate at the Dalles nav lock. These are the highest lift locks in the United States, and we essentially have one chance to get it right at each of these projects, so we work very closely with the Corps of Engineers and others to make sure they have what they need to keep them in good working order. And so again, thinking about just the Dalles, our sample navigation lock, that lock had 8 million tons of cargo in 2012, all moving by barge through the lock. That's 571 4-barge tows. That's a typical tow that moves on the river system. That's equal to 80,000 rail cars. So if you think of a unit train of being roughly 100 to 110 cars, that's almost 800 unit trains that did not have to move through the sensitive airshed of the Columbia River Gorge, but instead moved by barge tow. Or 275,000 trucks, not including their very likely empty backhauls. And just a graphic showing you what can move in a typical 4-barge tow. It's equal to 538 trucks. Okay, so just to spend a moment on a couple of recently completed projects on the river system. In the last 20 years, we had channel deepening. We had a 40-foot deep navigation channel from Astoria to Portland, and folks wanted to go deeper. They wanted to be able to handle larger ships and have the existing ships that we're calling load more fully so that we could be a more competitive system. And so we had a channel deepening project that wrapped up in late 2010, taking us down to minus 43 feet. And so the results of that channel deepening project is over $1 billion in public and private investments that have been made on the lower river system in less than 5 years' time. So that includes the first new grain export facility in North America in over 25 years. That's the EGT grain terminal, not built down in New Orleans or anywhere else. They build it here on the Lower Columbia River in Longview. We're very proud of that. And then we've had an incredible amount of investment at nearly all of the other grain export facilities on the Lower River. We also have investments in rail capacity at Vancouver, Kalama, and Portland. We have a new dry dock. It was in the news recently. You probably saw it at Vigor. And then we also have new barges and new towboats being built by Shaver and Tidewater. They are reinvesting in their fleets. They are planning for more tonnage and more items to move on the river system. And we also have had some recently completed projects on our inland river system. I mentioned those 8 navigation locks and all the work that goes into maintaining them, making sure they're in good working order. The Obama administration and a series of Congresses lined up investments to make in 3 of our navigation locks. These were completed in the winter of 2010 into 2011. These were enormous new lock gates that went in. Each one has a design life of over 50 years. So folks are actively investing in the future of the inland river system. So while we're talking about those investments and the fact that our federal agencies and others are planning for at least the next 50 years of our inland system, we do have others who are have other feelings, in particular about the Snake River dams. The sportswear company Patagonia has been putting out films and ads regarding the dams and trying to lump them in with 3 dams that recently came out. Michael had mentioned one of them, the Condit Dam, but then also the Elwha and the Glines Canyon dams up on the Elwha River. These were very different dams from the 4 lower Snake River dams. They had almost no hydropower being produced. They had no fish passage, no navigation. These were not the same kinds of dams as the Snake River dams. We'll talk more about the improvements that have been made there. I'm going to move on now to the Columbia River Treaty. Michael has already touched on that, but that was a treaty that was ratified in 1964 for 2 purposes at that time, flood control and coordinated hydropower production between the U.S. and Canada. And so it has worked pretty well for the last 40 years. It's become a model around the world for how 2 countries can work together to manage and understand the flows of a shared river system. It does not actually expire in 2024. Instead, what has happened is there's a 10-year notice period that commenced last year where either country can indicate that they would like changes to be made in 2024. There is one element that does expire, and that is flood control, prepaid flood control benefit that we enjoy with Canada. And then I've listed some other pretty significant issues that we've all become much more aware of since 1964 and are absolutely at the fore of the conversations today. And so we had Bonneville Power Administration and the Corps of Engineers jointly were the U.S. entity. They were tasked with doing a regional review. They pulled together a sovereigns team of our states, our tribes. Paul here was a key player in that. I'm sure he'll be talking about that in his presentation. And what culminated in that was a regional recommendation that was transmitted to the State Department in December 2013. And hydropower and flood control and the ecosystem were all highlighted, but then navigation and irrigation and other uses were as well. And so the State Department has had that document for the last 1.5 years plus and has been doing their own multi-agency review in Washington, D.C. And we await next steps. BIOP, Michael touched on this already, but this is our long-running fish case. Everybody has an opinion on it. My group has we have a subset of our group that has intervenor status in the case. I do think it's important to note that The BIOP that we have today is different from previous BIOPs. It is more collaborative. It has an element that recognizes climate change in it. It's called the Adaptive Management Implementation Plan, the AMIP. I think I got that acronym right. Essentially, it has a series of triggers such that the Corps and BPA and Bureau of Rec and others can respond to changes in our climate and can make changes to how the river system is run. So this was the Obama administration's effort to put their stamp on the BIOP and recognize that we need to be prepared for climate change. And so again, in noting that we're in a different period than we have been in the past, and I do believe that it's a more collaborative period. We have things like the Columbia River Tribal Accords that were signed in 2008 and actually more since then. We have states and tribes and utilities and navigation and the federal agencies partnering together outside the courtroom, which is a great place to be. No offense, Michael, to do work on the ground and in the rivers, in the tributaries and in the estuary to benefit our fish. And we're really hoping that that collaboration continues. It's really bearing fruit. And so what about our fish? I shamelessly stole some charts here from BPA showing how extensive the efforts have been to do work both in our tributaries around the Northwest, the places where young salmon hatch before they make their way to the Snake and Columbia River to eventually migrate out to the ocean, and then down in the estuary as well, the place where it's kind of do or die time. These fish need to rest and grow a bit before they make it out to the ocean. And this is where, again, so many of those partnerships are really bearing fruit, in particular with our tribes who are doing so much of that tributary work. We have very good news at the dams, too. You should all be proud of how your ratepayer money is being spent on things like removable spillway weirs, essentially slides for our juvenile fish, so that they have an easier time transiting through the dams as they make their way down the river and out to the ocean. We're now averaging 97% survival of the juvenile fish at our projects. I think that is astounding. We're hearing from our federal agencies that the survival rates are approaching those of undammed rivers. I am very pleased about how things are going. I think that all of us should be. And so what all that translates into is an increase in our 10-year running average on adult returns. If we do a better job of getting our fish out into the ocean, we hope for good ocean conditions out there, and then we smooth their way back to their spawning grounds. That's the whole life cycle. That is what we're trying to protect, and it's all coming home. You can see that white line that's moving through the yellow bars there. That's our 10-year running average for all of our stocks, and we're trending upward. And I've included my information there, but we'll be looking forward to questions toward the end as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Our final speaker tonight is Paul Lumley, Executive Director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, or CRITFIC, for those of you who like acronyms. He's a citizen of the Yakama Nation, which is located in central Washington state. Mr. Lumley worked at CRITFIC from 1987 to 2004 under several different capacities, and then returned to CRITFIC after 5 years in Washington, D.C. to begin his tenure as Executive Director in July 2009. Mr. Lumley has an extensive history working with Northwest tribes on salmon issues, particularly in the Columbia River Basin. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from Western Washington University in 1986. Paul will present an overview of the mixture of cultural and health issues that are currently impacting the river. These issues include fisheries, pollution, climate change, water rights, and the impacts on the culture and livelihood of those dependent on the river. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a great honor to be here. It's a great panel to be with. It's nice to finally meet Michael. I think I've heard your name a few times in the last month or so, and it's great to be back here with the League of Women Voters. I had spoken with your sister group in Washington State a few months ago on the Columbia River Treaty specifically, and I've always enjoyed working with your organization. I need to take a big step back and talk about the tribal perspective from really who we are as Indian people, and it'll give you a better grounding and understanding of why we do the things that we do. When the Creator put us Native people on this land, we couldn't survive, and He asked for animals and plants to step forward and sacrifice themselves so we humans could live, and the first to step forward was a salmon, followed by the game and the roots and the berries. And so the Creator gave these gifts to us and said, with these gifts, you can survive. These are your first foods. And if you take care of these first foods, they will always take care of you. And so that is a grounding of our culture, our religion, and our way of life in so many different ways. If tomorrow you'll be hopefully stopping by Celilo Falls, and you'll see a longhouse there. And in that longhouse, if you're ever lucky enough to be invited there to a first salmon ceremony, you'll hear people singing and praying and telling stories and talking about that relationship we have with the Creator, which is still strong today, as strong as it ever has been. So that's who we are as Indian people. And when we started working on the Columbia River with these new visitors, we saw that there were big changes coming, and the United States wanted to enter into a treaty with the United States. Enter a treaty with the tribes, and there's interesting language in here which I think might shed more light for you now that I told you about the first foods. The language includes the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary buildings for curing them, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots, and berries. So those are our first foods. And it was very clear from the minutes of the meetings when these treaties were being negotiated, the tribes would never have signed these treaties if their rights to these first foods were not reserved. So they were not granted to us, these rights. They were reserved by the tribes. They always had them, never gave them up. This shows the 4 tribes that I work for. I work for the Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Nez Perce. Most of the area in this map is above Bonneville Dam, so you'll be traveling through tribal areas tomorrow. The Warm Springs, for example, has a lighter shaded blue and a darker shaded blue. The lighter shaded blue are the ceded lands that we gave to the United States for various purposes, but in exchange we received certain rights to these lands for off-reservation hunting and gathering rights, primarily. You can see the same thing with Yakima, Umatilla, and Warm Springs, the lighter areas being ceded and the darker areas being the current reservation boundaries. One thing we didn't expect after the treaties were signed in 1855 was the dramatic decline in salmon runs. It's estimated to be on average of about 17 million a year, and it declined dramatically to just a few million a year. Could be as high as even 30 million a year in some of the larger years in the old days, but it declined very dramatically. Primarily as a result to overharvest in the ocean and lower Columbia River, as well as habitat destruction, deforestation, agricultural businesses, but we lost a lot of the fish. So during this time frame, the Columbia Basin was built out dramatically with dams, all kinds of other activities, urbanization, and that all came as a cost to the tribes. It came as a major cost to us. It was not free, and we're going to talk about some of those today. This is a photograph of Kettle Falls, which is located above Grand Coulee Dam. It was inundated in 1940. This dam in particular caused major destruction, not only to the tribes above this dam, but also the First Nations in Canada, because it blocked a major portion of the spawning habitat. Some of you may have heard that phrase, June hogs. Those are the really big fish. That's where these fish went. And so we lost a big part of the fish run when Grand Coulee Dam was built. Many of the tribes up there, same kind of cultural relationship to the fish that we have, that spiritual relationship. They lost all access to the fish. We want to change that. This is a photograph another photograph that you might have seen earlier in Professor Blumm's slide presentation. This is Celilo Falls. which was inundated by the construction of the Dalles Dam in 1957. And you'll be driving by it tomorrow. You won't see the falls. It's underwater. But you'll see the village site there, which was recently rebuilt. But it was a huge loss to the tribes in this area, not just the tribes that I work for, but tribes all over the Pacific Northwest. It was a major gathering place. People came really as an economy to exchange fish for other kinds of things of value that we needed to sustain ourselves. We also had a major place for tribes, families to come together, and our friends from all over the Pacific Northwest. And it was a great loss to this region when Silo Falls was inundated. During that time frame, it was pretty rough out there. And we often see and hear about the fights that went along the Puget Sound area. But it was just as bad out here along the Columbia. This photograph was taken not too far from where you're going to be tomorrow. And at the time, 1960s, we had to use our own guns to protect our fishing rights. It was pretty bad. The tribes at that time were fighting for their very rights of survival, and it was a very difficult time. Mentioned already a few times the major case law that was really changed the complexion of the Columbia Basin dramatically, and also the Pacific Northwest. Two court cases. The first in 1969 we referred to as U.S. v. Oregon, where a judge ruled the tribes had a right to a fair share of the fish. And in 1974, another court case, U.S. v. Washington, where that was later defined to be 50% of the harvestable surplus. Major court cases here that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and this is the law of the land. It was very difficult to implement. I'll have to tell you that it was so difficult that judges had to force the states to comply. It was a really rough time. This is a photograph that was taken during the Depression era of our tribal villages that were along the Columbia River before the dams were built. Nice homes. You can see fish drying out there. It's a nice car in front. This was a pretty nice place to live at that time, probably close to paradise. But it was the government's policy to move the Indians off the river, and they tried everything they could. Even with the dams, they couldn't get rid of us. But we lost a lot. A lot of the towns in that area that got inundated, non-Indian towns, they got relocated. Ours did not, and we are still waiting. This is a photograph taken last year that shows that we still have a major housing crisis out there. We used to have villages that dotted the area up and down the Columbia. They're all underwater now. We are still owed homes out there, and we're waiting. Been working with the federal government to see if they can comply with that obligation, meeting obstacles with both Congress and with the administration, but hopefully we'll try to get some solutions out there on the ground to help these folks out there that are really living in third world conditions. It really is sad. You'll drive near this area tomorrow. This is in the Dalles. It looks like a concentration camp there, but people are actually living there. It's very sad. So we have a very big river. You're going to see it tomorrow. Big dams on that river, and there are big obligations out there. The tribes have rights to those first foods. They have never given up on those rights. In fact, it's in those treaties, and it is the law of the land, and we're going to do everything we can in our power to protect our rights to those first foods. In 1977, the organization that I work for was formed, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. It was formed by 4 tribes, Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Nez Perce. The primary mission is to ensure a unified voice and 3 objectives. The first is to restore the fish runs, the second is to protect our fishing rights, and the third is to have a coordinated intertribal enforcement program. In Hood River, I have an enforcement program. I have a chief of police, I have several police officers, some dispatchers. They're out there to enforce tribal laws and also to protect our fishermen. We work in 3 primary species. Salmon is a big part of our work, but we also have a strong focus on lamprey and also sturgeon. Easing into a discussion here on the Columbia River Treaty, the Vanport flood was mentioned a little while ago, and not too far from here. Major flood A lot of people died, and they shouldn't have died. They were a community that was built in the floodplain without protection. It's unfortunate that that community was placed there, but they weren't allowed to be here in Portland because it was a community that was supposed to support a shipbuilding industry, and they didn't want that kind of a community in Portland, so they pushed them out. Before the flood, two countries were actually discussing a treaty, an international treaty, United States and Canada. At the time, they were including a broad range of interests, power, flood control, as well as the ecosystem, water uses, municipal, irrigation. But when this flood hit, both countries were spurred into action to never let a flood like this happen again. And they focused the treaty only on power and flood control. The rest they thought would be considered in domestic processes, which we later found out to be a big mistake. There were 3 dams in Canada that were built and 1 in Montana. As mentioned earlier, the treaty started in 1964. There is no end date, although there is an opportunity to change the treaty. The first opportunity for a unilateral notice by either country to withdraw from the treaty was in 2014. And there was a lot of activity in both countries leading up to that first opportunity to provide evaluations excuse me, on what we could do with the water, and it gave the tribes an opportunity to start working together and come up with solutions that would better respect the ecosystem. So you can see also that last bullet there where the tribes were not consulted and there was no fish and wildlife coordination. And at that time, in the 1960s, you recall that photograph I showed with the tribes that had guns in their hands, just protecting their fishing rights. So there's no surprise here, I suppose, that the tribes were not included in negotiations. This is what happened to the river. This is a graph that shows what the river used to look like and in terms of flow at the Dalles Dam. That's the dark blue shaded area. And then the yellow line there, that shows what happened after those dams were built. So they took a big part of that river that came in this big freshet in the spring and summer time frame when all those smolts used to swim out to the ocean, and they moved that whole chunk of water to a different time of the year. They moved it to a time of the year that would protect from flood control, and also they later found out they could make a lot of money off of power generation. So when all these dams were built, the Columbia River Treaty dams as well as all the others, it's important to notice what they really are, and they are floods. All these reservoirs behind each dam is a flood. It's a permanent flood. They're still here today. You just don't realize what you're seeing. So the first flood you're going to see tomorrow is behind Bonneville Dam. It's a big flood, it's still there. A lot of floods all the way up and down the Columbia, throughout the whole basin. And it was really designed to keep Portland dry. That flood in Vancouver, not too far from here, really shaped the whole Columbia River Basin. There were a lot of communities that were destroyed, not just the tribal community. There were valued communities, non-Indian and Indian alike, in Canada as well. This is a map, and I put some maps in the back for you. If you haven't picked one up, you might want to grab one, especially those who are going up the Columbia River tomorrow. This shows a map of the 15 tribes that formed a coalition in 2009 to address the Columbia River Treaty. We developed what was called a Common Views document. It's a one-page document that really is historic for us. We often didn't get along well with each other, but because of the Columbia River Treaty, we decided to come together and really accept this responsibility, which is the best opportunity in our lifetimes to change the way the Columbia River is managed. We'll never see an opportunity like this again. And so we decided to stop fighting with each other and get along with each other, and it changed everything. After that, then we met with the U.S. entity, BPA, and the Corps of Engineers, and decided there's a chance here for us to achieve a consensus with the tribes, the federal agencies, and then we brought in the states, 4 states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and started working on this joint document together, a regional recommendation. And from there, we also started doing work with the various stakeholders, Kristin's group and many others, environmental groups, the League of Women Voters, many others. One thing we know we have to do is we have to rethink flood control. If you don't want to be flooded, don't move into a floodplain. It's pretty simple. I don't know how easy it is to say that. I can't be more blunt than that, but people moved into the floodplain, and these dams gave people permission to do that. And that's what's holding us back. The more we controlled the floods, the more people moved into the floodplain. But we're going to have to find a way to manage this river differently, and that's going to have to mean a big public conversation about moving some people out of the floodplain. There are 3 primary blockages of salmon in the Columbia River Basin. Grand Coulee is a big one. I showed you a photograph of that. We got Dworshak and also Hell's Canyon. There's a big movement by the tribes and many others to try and restore fish passage to historic locations. Last year, my organization, CRIDFIC, hosted a conference and also a technical workshop that preceded it. We're very lucky to have all 15 tribes in the basin step forward and say they wanted to co-host with us, as well as the First Nations in Canada. It was a pretty big deal. During the technical conference, we found out that technically it's feasible to restore fish passage at every one of these dams. So we had the conference a month later. It changed the conversation. It was no longer a matter of if, but when. So that was big news, and we're hoping to make progress on that on the domestic side as well as to the Columbia River Treaty process. This red area is where salmon used to be but are now blocked by dams, and that's our project area. We want to restore fish passage at all these locations. It's also interesting to note that especially up in Canada and also in the upper reaches of the Snake River, that's where all the coolest water is. So this is where many of the glaciers are at. And so as climate change becomes to be a reality here, we've got to find a way to get salmon to where the cool water is. And that's going to be above these dams where salmon are currently blocked. We're already starting to see this. And climate change is here. It's real. The projections that we would transition from a snowfall-dominated system to a rainfall-dominated system, we saw that this year. I actually started snowshoeing as a hobby this last winter. It was a bad year to do that. It rained both times, and it rained hard in January when it should have been snowing. Took the snowshoes off and just hiked. It was really warm. It was very unusual. But that's what they say our future is going to be like. And if that's the case, I think we all should be very worried. Because the big freshet that we should have got in the spring when the snow melted happened in February, not in May. And what did come down was not very much water. What was left were really warm rivers with low water, and a lot of fish died. And a lot of people's lives were impacted as well. We were also seeing a lot of forest fires. And if this is our future, then I think we all ought to be very afraid. When it comes to the fish, it affects every part of their life cycle. Winter flooding affects the eggs and the juveniles when they're overwintering. The summer flows affects adult migration and spawning. We saw that in a big way this year. And the high water temperatures affect both adults and juveniles, and also affects their growth. I want to talk a little bit about contamination, because some of you are going upriver. I believe you might be going to the Hanford area, and there's a lot of chemicals out there in the river. And one particular, mercury, is a big problem for us. And it's actually exacerbated by the dams. When mercury gets into this low oxygen condition, like behind these dams and these big reservoirs, it methylates, so it sort of dissolves and becomes available to the biota. It means it gets into the fish, and then when we eat the fish, it gets into our bodies. The reservoirs actually are making this problem even worse. Now, I have a choice. I can decide not to eat the fish, but the fish don't have a choice. They have to swim in the river, so they're getting contaminated, and it's affecting their health. There's a big movement out there to address fish consumption standards for Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. In early 1990s, CRITFIC, my organization, participated in a multi-year study with Environmental Protection Agency. We found out they were eating 10 times more fish than the general public, and some of the contaminants in these fish are pretty scary when you compare that to how many fish we're eating. It took a long time, but eventually the state of Oregon changed their water quality standards to 175 grams per day. That's about the size of a steak. That's that large piece of fish there. That's one steak per day. I probably eat pretty close to that, and I'm an urban Indian. But a lot of the tribes think they eat much more than that. But Oregon was a leader. They stepped forward, and that is still to this day the most protective water quality standard in the nation by tenfold. It's amazing. We're working very hard right now to get Washington and Idaho to update their water quality standards. They're really dragging their feet. In fact, I think Environmental Protection Agency is going to have to step forward and promulgate the water quality standards for them, because both states are proving that they're not willing to do the right thing when it comes to consumption of fish and our health. And this is a benefit that's not going to just be for tribes. This will benefit everybody here in the state and everybody here in the Northwest. We have a lot of more issues in the river when it comes to transportation of coal and oil. Now, you out here probably know that there's already a few coal and oil trains that are going through the Columbia River Gorge, between 4 and 8 in total. And every time I go up the river or down the river, I see a coal train or an oil train. And the proposals out there are to dramatically increase that, and I mean dramatically. And so, of course, we're concerned because the tribes fish right along the Columbia River. We live right along the Columbia River. You're going to see the Columbia River Gorge, and there's a cliff, a freeway, a railroad track, and the river. There is no escape if there's a disaster. And with the kind of proposals we're seeing, it's not a matter of if there will be a disaster, it's just a matter of when.
Okay, are you close to finishing?
I am.
Good.
This is a couple photographs of coal that is already along the tracks. This is up in an area called Columbia Hills Park. And you can go out there and just dig up there and just everywhere. It's deep. This wasn't a train accident. This is just coming off of the trains. So there's actually already a disaster out there. This coal is everywhere. It's along the river and it's in the river. This is the proposals that are actually on the books, substantial proposals. You know, the oil one just in Vancouver is huge. It'd be the largest transfer station in the continent. This is what we want to avoid. This could happen here. Probably will happen here if these proposals get approved. Tribes put together their own salmon restoration plan in 1995 with a goal of doubling the salmon runs to 4 million. We just recently updated it. We're very proud of the plan. It's the only plan out there, even to this day, that looks at the salmon's entire life cycle and makes recommendations, and also for full recovery. This is the fish runs that are coming back now. So we are very proud of this as well. It's a lot of fish coming back. We'd hate to see more water years like we did. It could undo a lot of this progress, but this shows what happens when partnership takes hold of the Columbia River Basin. We can work together and we can start bringing the fish back. We all contribute to this. If you pay into your power bill, you've contributed to this too, and I thank you. So the tribal elders taught us that if we take care of our first foods, the first foods will take care of us. And that's how I'd like to end it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Now, I'm going to start the question period by asking if you have questions of each other, things that you would like to pursue or investigate further.
Yeah, I have a question for Kristin. You said that there were 40,000 jobs associated with the transportation on the Columbia Navigation Channel, and said that there were probably more, and I don't doubt that. But I'm interested in knowing what is the amount of employment generated by the Lewiston port. Because if we were to look on this map, I guess we don't have Lewiston. But it's not that far from Lewiston to Tri-Cities. And if you trucked products to Tri-Cities, you could take advantage of the navigation channel from Tri-Cities, and we wouldn't need a deep water port 465 miles inland in Idaho. So I'm kind of interested to know, first, of those jobs, my understanding is there's not very many jobs involved in Lewiston. And secondly, how do you balance the cost? There's dredging that has to take place to keep this deep water port open. Any ideas what the costs of that are?
Sure.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'll take a bite out of your last question first, and that was on the dredging. The lower Columbia River requires dredging every year to stay at minus 43 feet. Our inland river system requires almost no dredging. So there was dredging this past winter up near Lewiston and Clarkston in the lower Granite Pool. That was the first dredging that had taken place up there or anywhere in that area since the winter of 2005 into 2006. So it is, you could argue it's virtually maintenance-free as far as the dredging.
The costs of that dredging are paid for by federal taxpayers, right?
Yes, it's a federal navigation channel, and so federal dollars maintain that federal channel. And then you had questions about employment on our inland river system, in particular in the Lewiston area, and can't we just truck all of that wheat to the Tri-Cities and then put it on the river to come down here and then be put on ships? The issue is every time you touch a commodity, you add cost to the transportation of it. Out in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and northern Idaho, the name of the game is what your proximity is to the river system. The least amount of trucking you can do, the better. It is, as you can imagine, the most expensive mode of cargo transport. And so that is why you have a number of inland wheat elevators all through those pools, including in Lewiston and Clarkston. And in fact, that Lewiston elevator drains large swaths of eastern Washington, northern Idaho, even western Montana. Folks are just trying to get to that access to the river system because once it gets on barge, that is the low-cost way to transport bulk commodities, things like wheat. If it didn't make sense, they wouldn't be doing it, I guess is the short answer for you. It is the most efficient way of moving heavy bulk cargoes. It also enables our U.S. farmers to hopefully have a competitive edge when they are trying to get their wheat out to world markets where they're competing against the Australians and the Canadians and others who are also making investments in their transportation system. So this is an investment that we all make so that U.S. commodities can move in the most efficient way.
I'd like to address the dredging issue. This connection we have here in the basin of you take one action somewhere, it's a reaction somewhere else. And this is a really good example of it. When these dredging projects took place, they had to put that material somewhere. And in the lower Columbia River, they put it in a place called Rice Island and in another location, created these great big islands. And all these birds moved in there. And the population just exploded. Went from a minor population to now the largest population in this continent by a large amount. And they're eating a lot of fish. Now, I didn't cause that problem, but we have to find a way to address it. We can't just stand back and say, oh, the birds are just going to eat the fish. We're not doing all this work to bring the salmon back just so we can feed birds. The same thing with the sea lions. They figured out they could swim up to this dam, and it's a smorgasbord. And so they all started moving into the Columbia River. We had the largest population of sea lions last year than we've ever seen. You know, in the Puget Sound area, population of sea lions completely wiped out a salmon run. The tribes are not going to stand back and watch this happen. We didn't put these dams here. We didn't create these dredge spoil islands. We've got to find a way to address this. And just standing back and pretending that it's all about environmentalists and warm and fuzzy animals, and it's not that way. We have to make difficult decisions. This is not something that I ever wanted to do, which is to promote the culling of birds or the removal of sea lions, or even the death to sea lions. It's not something I ever wanted to do, but these are very difficult decisions, something that is not taken lightly by anybody. But it's a system that has been so dramatically altered that we have to make decisions like this.
One item I would add on that particular dredging project that you brought up on the Lower Snake, Michael, is that that sediment was clean, and so the Corps was able to deposit it just a little further downriver and then create resting and rearing habitat for juvenile salmon. So essentially creating shallow water habitat so that our baby fish, as they are making their way down the river on their way to the ocean, have places where they can rest, gather their strength, and then continue their journey. So it really is, in my opinion, a good example of a win-win project.
Imagine what would happen if the river was free-flowing all the way down the Snake River. We wouldn't have to worry about so much habitat, artificial habitat restoration.
Mother Nature will bat last eventually.
Eventually. We won't see it, but...
Okay, other questions for each other? Okay, so that round of addressed a couple of the audience questions already. Professor Blumm, sort of two questions. What's the likelihood of changing Western water rights laws, and how would you go about doing it? What sort of things, are there models that would be more appropriate for our region?
Well, yeah, tried to say it wasn't very likely, but I don't see a good future for a system that was founded out of the mining camps of the 19th century, and that is based on really a kind of an artificial rigidity that things aren't going to change. It's based on first in time, the old rights get the priorities. We do have like in-stream flow rights that we've created since the system was established, but they're all what a water lawyer would call junior. So in flow years like this year, they get cut off. So it's a system based on temporal hierarchy, and it just isn't responsive to a climate change-induced world. So I admit it's not very likely. However, Eastern water law, which is quite a bit different than Western water law, has gone to terms in many states. And maybe that's something the states should start to think about, is that a water right doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't have to be inherited 4 generations down. Maybe a 20-year or 25-year term is enough to recapture the investments. We do that kind of thing in zoning law. We amortize non-conforming uses, and we say, well, after a certain amount of time, you've got the benefit of being non-conforming. Now you're going to have to either be conforming or you're going to have to stop. Well, maybe we should start to think about that in terms of water law. I think that the states should think about a water law compact to make sure that we have some proposals to divert substantial amounts of Columbia Basin water, mostly in Washington, that really don't seem to could meet any kind of cost-benefit analysis if you take into account the value of the downstream fishery. So it's not going to be easy. Low is the answer. But
Could I add to that?
Yes, and I'm advised that we should all speak into our microphones.
Sorry.
I'm interested in what Professor Blumm has to offer in terms of a new way of looking at water rights. The tribes have treaties and treaty rights to the fish, and I doubt they would want to put a 25-year limit on it. I don't think that's what's being proposed, but I do believe that we're going to be entering an era where water is going to be gold.
The entire West.
Yes. Not just the Columbia River Basin, but with all these people moving in, with climate change, it is going to be a very difficult future for us when it comes to water rights.
Yeah, I would just say that I differentiate the state-granted water rights system, which is first in time from the reserved water rights that the tribes have for their food that you mentioned. So I don't think that the term is appropriate in Indian Treaty reserved rights, but I think it's worth thinking about in state-granted water rights, which came afterwards.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions that will take us somewhat further afield. One is observing that we're due for an earthquake and a tsunami, and what does that mean for the river system and the population living along the river system in what might be 1,000-year floodplains? Anyone want to comment on that?
Take a stab at that. There are a number of working groups at the state and federal level who have been trying to tackle that question. How do we respond to those who are hurt? How do we respond to the need to start moving cargo and people again? There are interagency work groups that are meeting every 2 months that we're aware of, who are trying to address how we will meet the needs of the people on the coast who will be hardest hit, how to get first responders and others from the Willamette Valley out there. I mean, it's a big issue when you think about the impact to roads and bridges and all of our typical modes of transport. So folks are looking at every conceivable way of getting help to those who will be in need, especially by water and by air, given how our surface transportation will be impacted.
Have you looked at how far a tidal wave or the tsunami would come up the river?
Yes.
And the answer is?
Oh, I couldn't tell you how many miles offhand, but it's actually not that far. The big impact will be to our coastal communities. The ports all along the coast will be severely impacted to the point where it will be difficult to have ships with supplies and people call on those ports. So then the question is, how do you get the needed services and the other things to those hard-hit areas? So those are the questions people are trying to answer right now.
I think it's doubtful there'll be permanent damage. There'll be a lot of infrastructure that'll have to be replaced, but I don't think it'll be permanently mothballed. I don't think we're going to see, for example, 10 dams just be mothballed. I think if there's damage, they'll just get replaced. So when it comes to the Columbia River, I don't see permanent change, although I'd like to see it. I don't think an earthquake will give us that kind of change. The way we use energy, the way we use water, more efficient we become, those are the kind of changes for the future that will really have long-standing benefits to the basin in terms of our lives and the natural resources.
Okay.
I have just a small add-on to flood control. The dams I was talking about on the Snake River, they don't supply any flood control. The dams below that do, but the Snake River dams don't supply any flood control. So there's no flood control benefit from those dams.
The Idaho dams were irrigation focused.
Well, mostly navigation. And they're mostly not in Idaho.
The lower Snake, sure.
They're in Washington, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have flood control benefits.
Okay, I'm going to put a pause to the taping part of our program. Thanks to our audience for participating and for joining with us to learn something more about the Columbia River. This has been a presentation of the League of Women Voters of Portland, and thank you for joining us.